October 31st, 1956. A 14-year-old boy stood at his mother's bedside and felt nothing. Mary McCartney had been fighting for months. The cancer had started in her breast, then spread like whispered secrets through her body. She was a nurse. She knew what was coming. Her sons Paul and Michael watched her fade, day by day, until there was almost nothing left to hold on to. Jim McCartney, their father, moved through the rooms like a ghost, trying to be strong. But Paul saw through it. He saw everything. The way his father's hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. The way Michael, only 12, had stopped talking at dinner. The way the walls themselves seemed to be holding their breath. Mary had been the center of their world. Not just a mother, a force. She'd worked long shifts at the hospital, come home exhausted, and still found energy to make sure her boys ate properly, did their homework, dreamed big. "You can be anything," she'd told Paul once, running her fingers through his dark hair. Anything at all. Now she was dying in the front bedroom, and Paul felt like he was watching it happen to someone else. The doctors had tried. Mastectomy, radiation, hope packaged in pills and needles. But cancer doesn't negotiate. By late October, Mary was skeletal, her skin translucent, her breathing shallow. The house had become a waiting room for the inevitable. Paul spent those final weeks in a strange state of numbness. He went to school, came home, sat with his mother, said the things you're supposed to say, but inside something had frozen solid. Later he would try to explain it, this emotional shutdown, but the words never quite captured it. It was like someone had reached into his chest and turned off a switch. On that last day, Mary opened her eyes one final time. Jim was there. The boys were there. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Just a look, one last look that said everything and nothing. Then she was gone. Paul walked out of the room, down the stairs, into the Liverpool evening. He didn't cry. The funeral was on a Thursday. Gray skies, cold rain, the kind of weather Liverpool specializes in. Relatives gathered, neighbors brought casseroles. Everyone kept saying how sorry they were, how Mary was in a better place now, how the boys would be all right. Paul nodded, shook hands, thanked people for coming, but he didn't cry. Michael broke down at the graveside, 13 years old and sobbing into their father's coat. Jim's face was a mask of controlled anguish, the British way of falling apart. But Paul stood there, dry-eyed and distant, watching them lower his mother into the ground. He felt like he was observing the scene from somewhere far away, like this was happening to another family, in another city, in another life. Later that night, alone in the bedroom he shared with Michael, Paul lay in the dark and tried to access the grief everyone else seemed to feel. He waited for the tears. They never came. The days that followed were a blur of adjustment. Jim went back to work. He had to, they needed the money. The house felt too big and too small at the same time. Too many reminders of Mary, and yet somehow she'd vanished completely. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Her perfume still lingered in the bathroom, but she was gone, and 14-year-old Paul McCartney had no idea how to process that fact, so he didn't. He did what boys from Liverpool do when things hurt too much to look at directly. He found something else to focus on. Music had always been there, humming in the background of his life. Now it moved to the foreground. His father had bought him a trumpet for his birthday. Paul traded it in for a guitar. He wanted to sing. And you can't sing with a trumpet pressed to your lips. The guitar became everything. A companion, a shield, a language for feelings he couldn't speak out loud. He taught himself to play, rewiring the strings backwards because he was left-handed, spent hours in his bedroom working out chords, learning songs from the radio, writing his own. The house would fall quiet in the evenings, and Paul's guitar would fill the silence where his mother used to be. Jim McCartney worried about his boys. Paul was too controlled, too composed. It wasn't natural for a kid to lose his mother and then just carry on. But Paul insisted he was fine. Fine. That word became his armor. "How are you doing, Paul?" "Fine." "Are you all right, son?" "Fine." "Do you want to talk about it?" "No, I'm fine." But what nobody knew, what Paul barely understood himself, was that the grief hadn't gone away. It had just gone underground. He threw himself into school, into friendships, into this new world of rock and roll that was exploding out of America and lighting up every teenage mind in Liverpool. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Little Richard. These men were singing about feelings Paul couldn't access in his own life, and somehow that made it bearable. Then came July 6th, a church festival in Woolton. The Quarrymen were playing, a skiffle group led by a tough, sharp-witted 16-year-old named John Lennon. Paul went to watch, guitar in hand, just another kid in the crowd. But something happened that afternoon, something neither of them could have predicted. They were introduced after the show. Ivan Vaughn, a mutual friend, made the connection. "John, this is Paul. Paul plays guitar." John was unimpressed at first. Another kid with a guitar, so what? But then Paul picked up the instrument and played 20 Flight Rock note perfect, all the lyrics memorized. fingers moving like he'd been born doing this. John was hooked. Here was someone who could actually play, someone who could match him. More than that, someone who understood what it felt like to have the ground drop out from under you. Because John's mother, Julia, had died just a year earlier. A drunk driver. A policeman's car, ironically. John was 17. He'd been living with his Aunt Mimi for years, but Julia had come back into his life, teaching him banjo, encouraging his music. Then she was gone, hit by a car outside Mimi's house. John found out when a policeman came to the door. 2 boys, 2 dead mothers, 2 wounds that wouldn't heal. They never talked about it directly. British lads don't do that, especially not in the 1950s, but it was there, hovering between them, a shared understanding that didn't need words. They'd both lost the most important person in their world. They'd both learned that life could be cruel and random. They'd both discovered that music was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. Paul joined the Quarrymen, then George Harrison, then Ringo. The group evolved, changed names, got better. The Quarrymen became the Beatles. Hamburg happened. Brian Epstein happened. Ed Sullivan happened. The world opened up like a flower and swallowed them whole. And through it all, Paul never cried about his mother. Not when they played the Cavern Club. Not when they recorded Love Me Do. Not when they conquered America. Not even when Brian Epstein died in 1967, and Paul had to be the strong one again, holding everything together, making sure the Beatles didn't fall apart. He kept that grief locked away, buried so deep he forgot it was there. But grief doesn't disappear. It waits. The 1960s became the 1970s. The Beatles imploded. John left. George left. The partnership that had defined Paul's adult life disintegrated into legal battles and bitter recriminations. Paul found himself alone again, adrift, the center not holding. That's when the cracks started showing. He married Linda Eastman in 1969, an American photographer who saw through his carefully constructed facade. She was patient, kind, she didn't push, but slowly, over months and years, she helped him access parts of himself he'd been avoiding since he was 14. One night in the early 1970s, they were at High Park Farm in Scotland, just the 2 of them, away from the chaos of fame and failure. Linda was in the kitchen, Paul was in the living room, and for no particular reason, he started thinking about Mary. Really thinking about her, not the sanitized memory he'd constructed, the real person, the nurse who'd worked herself to exhaustion, the mother who'd believed in him when he had no reason to believe in himself, the woman who'd died too young, too fast, leaving him with nothing but questions and an inability to feel. Something broke open. 20 years of frozen grief came rushing out in a single overwhelming wave. Paul sat on the couch and cried like he'd never cried before, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Linda heard and came running, found him collapsed in on himself, finally letting go of the weight he'd been carrying since 19. She held him, didn't say anything, just held him while he fell apart. Afterwards, when the storm had passed, Paul felt different, lighter, like he'd been walking around with a stone in his chest and suddenly it was gone. He could breathe again, feel again, be human again. It was around this time that Paul had the dream. He was struggling with the aftermath of the Beatles' breakup, wondering if he'd made a mistake, if he'd destroyed something precious. The pressure was immense. The criticism was relentless. He felt lost. Then, one night, Mary came to him. Not literally, he knew it was a dream, but she appeared, looking just as he remembered her from before the illness, healthy, smiling, whole, and she spoke to him. 2 words that would become immortal. Let it be. Paul woke up with those words echoing in his head. Let it be. Don't fight so hard. Don't carry it all. Let it be. He went straight to the piano and wrote the song in one sitting. The melody came easily, naturally, like his mother was guiding his hands. The lyrics poured out. When he finished, he knew he'd written something special, not just a song but a message, from Mary to him, from him to everyone else who'd ever lost someone and didn't know how to keep going. Let It Be became one of the most beloved songs in popular music. Millions of people have found comfort in its gentle wisdom, but for Paul, it was always personal, a letter to his mother, a thank you for the dream, a recognition that she'd never really left. The years continued, more albums, more tours, more grief. John's murder in 1980, George's death in 2001, Linda's passing in 1998. Each loss reopened the wound, but Paul had learned by then how to let himself feel. He didn't shut down anymore. He cried, he mourned, he let people in. In interviews, when journalists asked about Let It Be, Paul would sometimes talk about his mother, about how losing her at 14 had shaped everything that came after, about how he'd gone 2 decades without properly grieving, about how music had been both his escape and his salvation. I didn't cry when she died, he said once. Decades later, his voice quiet but steady. I couldn't. I just shut down. It took me 20 years to finally let myself feel it. The interviewer asked why. Why so long? When you're young, and something that massive happens, you do whatever you need to survive. For me, that meant not feeling it, not looking at it, just moving forward.
Music gave me somewhere to put all that pain without having to acknowledge what it was. He paused, smiled a little. But you can't outrun grief forever. Eventually it catches up, and when it does, you either face it, or it destroys you. I got lucky. I had Linda. I had time. I had that dream. And I finally let myself miss my mum. Mary McCartney died when Paul was 14. He didn't cry at her funeral, didn't cry for months, years, decades. But when he finally did, when he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost, it didn't destroy him, it freed him. The boy who couldn't cry became the man who wrote Let It Be. The son who lost his mother became the artist who taught millions of people how to find peace in pain. The 14-year-old standing at that bedside in Liverpool became Sir Paul McCartney, still performing at 80, still creating, still finding new ways to honor the woman who gave him everything and left too soon. Mary McCartney never got to see her son become a Beatle, never heard Yesterday or Hey Jude, never saw him knight, never met her grandchildren. She died in a small house in Liverpool, leaving behind 2 boys and a husband who had to figure out how to keep going without her. But in a way, she's been there for all of it, in every song, every performance, every moment of grace Paul has managed to conjure out of chaos. She's there in the melody of Let It Be, in the gentleness he learned from Linda, in the way he still talks about her with reverence and love. 20 years is a long time to hold back tears, but sometimes grief needs time. Sometimes the heart needs to build up enough strength to break open. Sometimes a 14-year-old boy has to become a 50-year-old man before he can finally say goodbye to his mother. Paul McCartney was 14 when Mary died. He didn't cry. Not then. Not for 20 years. But when he finally did, when he finally let himself feel what he'd been running from since 1956, it wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of healing, the beginning of forgiveness, for himself, for his inability to feel, for all the ways grief had shaped him without his knowledge. The beginning of understanding that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. Mary McCartney lives on in her son's music, in the millions of people who found comfort in Let It Be, in the legacy of a boy from Liverpool who turned his pain into something beautiful and gave it back to the world. He didn't cry for 20 years, but when he did, it was worth the wait.